Dynamics Lab and the Center for Sea Level Change at New York University.
What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more. Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more.
This is a fraught time of year for many of us. Whether you're in a new relationship or one that's lasted decades, the pressure is on as February 14th approaches.
What is love?
That's the day of all days when you want to make the depth of your feelings clear to the person you love. But why? What drives humans as a species, and love is a universal human trait, to such extraordinary lengths for love? Why is passion such an all-consuming passion? Well, that question is complicated, as anything so fundamental to humanity is, but in her latest book, writer, broadcaster, and evolutionary anthropologist Anna Machin tries to answer it. She's distilled the latest research in human behavior and neuroscience to understand the many forms of love, from romantic love to parental love, friendship, and religious devotion, and shows what connects them and what ultimately connects us. Her book is called Why We Love, the New Science Behind Our Closest Relationships. Dr. Machin, welcome to our program.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Now, you write that you wanted to make your book an expansionist exploration of love. What do you mean by that?
I kind of wanted to make it big and dramatic, I suppose. In the past, there's lots of books about love, I'm aware of that, but they've all kind of tried to find the one answer to what it is. And as an anthropologist, my job is to understand a human trait or behaviour at every level of explanation and in every single context that it arrives. And when you study love like I have, I've studied it for about 20 years now, you realise that you can't reduce it to that single answer and you can't just focus on one sort of love. So the idea behind the book was to go from that reductionist idea to the expansionist idea and say, okay, here is all the possible love you can have, and here are all the things that feed into that experience of love for you. So it's not just going to give you the neuroscientific answer or the psychological answer or the sociological answer. It's going to give you every possible answer we can find at every level of explanation, because only then are we really, as anthropologists, doing our job properly.
Well, as an evolutionary anthropologist, let's begin with the evolution of love. So why did nature equip us with this behavior?
Okay, so we are arguably the most cooperative species on the planet, both in terms of how many different sorts of people we cooperate with, all the different ways we have to cooperate, and how long those cooperative relationships last. You know, we can be with people for decades and decades and decades. And this is partly due to a sort of an anomaly, an anatomical quirk that occurred. We've got really massive brains and we walk on two legs. And therefore, for example, we need each other's help to raise our children, because our children are very dependent. They're born far too soon so that big brain can fit through the birth canal. So we have very dependent children. And if you think of all the people who feed into your children's lives, your friends, your family, professionals, whoever it might be, we are cooperating to raise those children. The problem is cooperation is really stressful. We have to compete for resources. We have to coordinate with each other. We have to exist in these really stressful hierarchies. So we need something that's going to motivate and reward us for carrying out these survival critical relationships, even though they're really, really tough sometimes. And the answer to that evolution came up with is love. So basically, love is biological bribery. It's something that we get given to reward us and make sure that we carry on trying.
Now, since evolution has equipped us for love, it's clearly got some deep biological roots, and some of these roots work like, as you write in your book, like an addiction. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So we have 4 different neurochemicals that come into the mix when you are falling in love and when you're in love. And some of them you will have heard of. So we've got oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and beta endorphin. And they variously motivate and reward you for starting relationships, and then they addict you to the person that you're with to make sure that you stick around, and that if you separate from them for whatever reason, you go out to work, whatever it might be, you go on a work trip, you start to crave that person, like an addict craves heroin, and that draws you back to the person. And the reason why they are addictive, and the reason why beta endorphin in particular is so addictive, is it's your body's opiate. So it is a highly addictive chemical like heroin, like morphine, and it uses the same mechanism to make sure you stick with the people you love.
So these chemicals in the brain are the bribe you were just talking about.
Yep, that's your biological bribe. At the most basic level, that is the mechanism of love.
So the chemistry between two people really is chemistry.
Oh, completely. Yes. What you feel when you have that chemical spark, what you're feeling in particular are oxytocin and dopamine kicking off in your brain. So when people talk about chemistry, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a natural chemical reaction going on in your brain.
Well, if love is an addiction like that, you compare the breakdown of a relationship to going cold turkey. Is it really like that?
It is, because you basically go into a form of chemical and opiate withdrawal. And so you have this actual physical sensation of pain that occurs, but you also obviously have that psychological pain, which comes from having been very closely attached to someone, and you undergo a really intense separation distress.
How else is our biology built for love?
We have this amazing phenomenon which is known as biobehavioral synchrony, and I think in one sense this sums up to me how critical love is to our survival. The way biobehavioral synchrony works is when you're with somebody you love, and it might be your lover, it might be a close friend, it might be your child, what you notice with people, and you will have noticed this, when they're together, people mirror each other in terms of their body behaviour, their body language. But if you look inside their body, what's happening at the same time is their physiology comes into synchrony. So their heart rate, their body temperature, their blood pressure also match each other. And then if you look into the brain, we see matching synchrony in activations of the brain, so the areas of the brain that are firing off, and we see synchrony in the levels of those neurochemicals we've been talking about. And so what's happened is evolution thinks that this is so critical that you bond to this person as tightly as possible that it's actually engaged every mechanism in your body to make sure that you are as tightly bonded to that other person as possible. And that's really how important love is. I think it's the most astonishing phenomenon.
Now, your book looks beyond romantic love. You look at the similarities and differences with other forms of love. So let's start with parental love.
Yes, parental love is one of my other big passions. I've spent a lot of time particularly researching fathers and the bonds they build with their children. But parental love is really interesting. So the neurochemistry that underpins parental love is the same, but we see obviously different activations in the brain because it doesn't have that lustful element, and it has a lot more elements to do with nurturing and care associated with it. But what's really interesting about parental love is not that it differs in terms of intensity, but the attachments we build, the bonds we build to our children do differ a little depending on whether you're a dad or a mum. And when we look at the activations in the brain when that child is interacting with their parent, when we look at the parent's brain, we see slightly different interactions. So for some things, parents are in synchrony. So things like empathizing, nurturing to a certain extent, both brains are firing off and enable the parent to do that. But if we look at mum's brain, we see the most activation in the core of her brain, in that emotional center of the brain, where we have the nurturing, the affection, but we also have risk detection, which is really important. And in part that's because mothering is as ancient as time. Human fathering is probably only about 500,000 years old. So when we look at their brains, we do see activation in the center, but the peak in activation is actually in the cortical area of the brain, the bit that looks like a walnut. And that's where your conscious brain sits and all those higher brain processes sit. And that might be because it's so young, so it's sitting in that bit. But also it shows us that mums and dads have actually evolved to do slightly different things in relation to their children. And that's really interesting because evolution doesn't like redundancy. So if you've got these two parents doing this job, we're going to make sure that they do slightly different things so that child gets a full developmental environment. What's fascinating about that, though, because people always go, what about single parents, or what about gay parents, for example? What we see there is the immensity of the human brain, because what happens there is if you've got a single parent or if you have a primary caretaking gay or lesbian mother or father, what you see is the brain has adapted to enable that person to actually have the activations of both mum and dad in a heterosexual relationship. So that child will still get the full developmental environment. So I think the bonds that parents can build to their children are astonishing. They are so powerful, and the brain will adapt as much as it needs to make sure that child is given everything they need to survive.
Now, friendship is another form of love that you spend time exploring in your book. Tell me what science has revealed there.
What's really interesting about friendship, and what I love about friendship, is in a way it's the love we underestimate, I think, a little bit. We place romantic love on a pedestal, we replace parental love on a pedestal, but friendship we kind of neglect a little bit. But what all the science is showing is that as far as our brains are concerned, as far as our biobehavioral synchrony is concerned, as far as the neurochemicals that are released when you interact with your friends, you love them. And maybe partly, I think here in the West, and particularly in the countries, we are quite restrained about saying that we love our friends. It's so funny. I spoke to quite a lot of British people and said to them, do you love your friends? And they would go, I suppose so. And then I would say to them, do you love your dog? Oh, yeah, I love my dog. And it's just funny. We have this slightly odd attitude to it. Whereas actually when I spoke to people in the more Mediterranean countries or maybe the South Americas, they are much more passionate about their friends. But what I love about friends is friends fulfill for us something that romantic love in particular can't fulfill. For women, a study we did at Oxford showed that women are more emotionally intimate with their best friends than they are with their lover. They are more likely to be completely open with their best friend and find that their best friend is their greatest emotional support, which I find fascinating. And when we look at men and they talk about their best friends are a source of relaxation and release. They're somewhere where they can truly be themselves. So we've kind of got these two people in a romantic relationship who maybe are still displaying a little bit to each other to keep each other attracted. But when they're with their best friends, they can truly be who they are. And I think that's really interesting. And certainly now we're looking particularly more and more people being single. You know, the rates of single habitation are going up. People are choosing not to be in relationships. Friends, in a way, are coming forward to replace that romantic partner for those people. Their friends are really their family and their lover.
Let's talk about religious love and nuns and brain scanners.
Well, this is really interesting. I must admit, before I did the book, I wasn't really that up to date with religious love. But I find it fascinating because it says so much about the human capability to love. Because with religious love, it means that you can love without the other person in the relationship manifesting in physical form, which, when we talk about love or we talk about bonding, it's a very physical process. There's touch involved. You know, the person's in front of you. You can see them. The fact that we can love a god, some gods, saints, whoever it might be, I think is astonishing. It tells us a lot about the human brain. And yes, there was a study done to place Carmelite nuns in a scanner and wanted them to commune with God, to go into a mystic state in the scanner. And what they showed, first of all, was they saw the fingerprint of love, which is quite a distinctive fingerprint in the brain when we look at the scanner. So first of all, they loved God. But what was even more interesting was the areas of the brain that we would expect to light up if you were interacting with a fellow human, the areas that are associated with reciprocity and trust and empathy and the recognition of a fellow human also lit up. So these nuns are genuinely having a love relationship with somebody who is in human form, but who they manifest within their brain. And I think that is an astonishing ability and a really unique and special sort of love.
So are the nuns still getting all of the same brain chemicals that those of us who have a physical relationship with a person?
We don't know that yet. So I spoke to a lot of nuns for my book. This was a solid and true human relationship. But no, we still don't know whether or not those are being released. I think it probably would be.
Well, humans are one species, but there's an enormous amount of diversity in our species. What are we learning about the many individual variations in love?
Again, really interesting, because there is a huge individual variation in love. You know, how I love and how you love are going to be different. And that's because there's so many different things coming in. And there's two sort of dimensions to that. There's the biological dimension, which is underpinned by things like your genetics. So there's quite a lot of diversity in terms of the genetic code when it comes to love and relationships. And that underpins some of the differences that we experience when we're in love. So, for example, we might look at the genes associated with oxytocin and find that some people carry a gene which makes it more likely that they will be motivated to form long-term relationships, for example, or will find part of the gene which means they're much better at empathizing. So some of it is under genetic influence, some of it is under environmental influence. So that's things like particularly the environment in which you were raised, particularly for your first 2 years of life, is really important in terms of how you experience love, because your brain was still building at that point. But when we look at the social side of things, the sociological side, you know, there are so many things: your history, your politics, your religion, the rules that have been put in place about love. You know, what is acceptable love, what's unacceptable love, at what stage should you declare your love, what are the rituals you should use for your love, your family, your friends. All of these different things are going to input into how you experience love. And I think maybe the most striking example of that public element of love is, for example, there are 72 countries in the world where homosexuality is still illegal. So whilst in some countries you can express your love if you're gay, in those countries you cannot. You know, you can't post your updates on Facebook. You can't declare your love for somebody on Instagram. And that's going to affect how you individually experience love. So it's a really multifaceted number of inputs that affect how you feel love.
You spend a little time on the dark side of love. You say, ultimately, love is about control. Seems kind of sinister. What are the implications of that?
Ultimately, love is about control, because if we think back to that argument about why it evolved, which is, evolution wants you to pass those genes down the generations, and you've got to do that by cooperating and falling in love and raising your children, that's control. It's a benign control, but that's what love is in terms of evolutionary theory. But the problem we have is that really fundamental need we have for love, unfortunately, can be exploited by people who have that knowledge, and it can be used to manipulate you or abuse you or coerce you. And I think what arguably separates us partly from animals in terms of love is we do and can use love to manipulate other people. That is one of the downsides. That's a cost in a way we pay for love overwhelmingly being a positive thing, but unfortunately there is this darker side to it as well.
You compare our need for love to our need for food and air. So why ultimately is it so important to us?
This is the argument that says love is not an emotion, and love is not an emotion. Love is far too complex to be an emotion. Even people who research emotions are like, yeah, we can't put it in that box. It contains emotion, obviously. It contains passion and affection and anger and fear and all these different emotions, but it contains so many other things. And really, if we look at it, and particularly its role in motivating us and the role that dopamine in particular has in motivating us, it seems to be more a motivation, meeting a need, than it is in fact an emotion. And if we look at the needs, the fundamental needs you have in life, they are, water, food, shelter, safety. And there is a big argument now to add to that love, because if you don't have love, whether it's cooperating with your friends or it's love for your partner or your children, you're not going to get very far in life. You're not going to survive. Babies need love because otherwise they don't survive, or they are developmentally very damaged. So we argue now that actually love is a fundamental need that sits at the very basis of that need pyramid, and it sits alongside things like the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat. It's a fundamental life need.
So love it or hate it, you can't live without it.
Absolutely, no, and you can't escape it.
Dr. Machin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Dr. Anna Machin is a writer, broadcaster, and evolutionary anthropologist. Her new book is called Why We Love: The New Science Behind Our Closest Relationships.